The winter sun was sinking behind the distant hills, casting long purple shadows across the empty countryside. The dirt road, crusted with frozen mud, stretched endlessly under the widow Lena's trembling feet. She had been walking since dawn, clutching her daughter Mara's tiny hand, though her grip had weakened with every passing hour. The cold was biting, the wind sharp, and their thin clothes did little to protect them. Every step felt heavier than the last, each breath harsher in the frozen air. Lena's legs finally buckled, sending her to one knee. She tried to rise again, but her limbs trembled uncontrollably. Mara tugged her arm, her small voice tight with fear. "Mama, please." "Don't fall." Lena forced a smile, though her lips were cracked and pale. "I'm all right, sweet pea. Just tired." But her eyes blurred, the world tilting. She had barely eaten in 2 days. Everything she found went to Mara. By now, her body was at its limit. They had nowhere left to go. The last farmhouse they approached had slammed its door in her face when she told them she had no money to pay for lodging. After her husband's death, everything had spiraled downward: debts, sickness, and then eviction. For weeks now, mother and daughter had wandered, searching for any place that would take them in. Mara squeezed her hand again. "Mama, I'm cold." Lena opened her mouth to comfort her, but the words never came. Her vision dimmed. She collapsed onto the frozen road, snowflakes settling on her hair like tiny white feathers. "Mama!" Mara cried, kneeling beside her. The child shook her mother's shoulders desperately, her breath turning to mist in the growing cold. Tears dripped down her rosy cheeks as she tried to shield Lena's face from the wind with her small coat. The road was deserted. No houses, no travelers, just white fields and the darkening sky. Mara looked around wildly, hoping for someone, anyone, to appear. And then she heard it. The distant creak of wagon wheels, a horse's snort, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the frozen earth. Mara leapt up, waving her arms desperately. A large wagon rounded the bend. At the reins sat a broad-shouldered man in a wool coat and leather hat, snowflakes dusting his beard. His blue eyes narrowed with concern as he saw the child jumping in the middle of the road. He pulled the reins sharply. "Whoa!" The horse halted. The man climbed down quickly. "What's wrong, little one?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. Mara pointed at her mother, sobbing. "She fell. She won't wake up." The man hurried over, kneeling beside Lena. He touched her forehead ice cold. Her pulse was faint, her lips pale. "Dear God," he murmured. He lifted his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then looked at Mara. "I'm gonna help your mama." "You're safe now, all right?" Mara nodded, trembling. The man scooped Lena into his strong arms as though she weighed nothing. He carried her to the wagon, laying her gently on a bed of wool blankets. Then he lifted Mara inside too, tucking her close to her mother. "What's your name?" he asked as he climbed up. "Mara," she whispered. "I'm Caleb Ward," he said softly. "You're both coming with me." He cracked the reins, wheels rolling once more through the snow. The last light of day glowed behind them as the wagon carried the helpless widow and her scared little girl toward safety, toward a ranch that would soon change their lives forever. The wagon creaked steadily through the gathering dusk as Caleb urged his horse onward. The wind had grown fiercer, lashing flakes of snow against the canvas covering of the wagon. But inside, the warmth of the blankets and the shelter of the wooden frame offered Lena and Mara a fragile refuge. Caleb kept glancing back, checking that the widow was still breathing and that the little girl remained close by her side. When the ranch finally came into view, a spread of warm lantern-lit windows glowing against the white countryside, Mara pressed closer to her mother. After days of fear and wandering, the sight of light felt almost unreal. Caleb pulled up near the porch and jumped down. "Stay close to me, Mara," he said softly. "We'll get your mama inside." He lifted Lena again with gentle strength, careful not to jostle her weakened body. The front door swung open before he reached it, revealing an older woman, Mrs. Hawkins, his longtime housekeeper, who gasped when she saw the half-frozen mother and child. "Caleb Ward, what on earth?" "No time," he said quietly. "She needs warmth and fast." Mrs. Hawkins stepped aside, ushering them in. The warmth inside the cabin washed over them immediately glowing lamps, a crackling fire, and the comforting smell of stew simmering on the stove. Mara hesitated on the threshold, unsure if she was allowed to enter such a home, but Caleb touched her shoulder lightly. "You're welcome here," he assured her. They carried Lena to the guest room. Mrs. Hawkins fetched quilts, warm water, and a cloth. Caleb watched anxiously as they checked her pulse and tried to raise her temperature. Mara stood by the bed, holding her mother's hand with a fierce, protective grip. "She's exhausted and half-frozen," Mrs. Hawkins murmured. "But I think she'll pull through. She just needs rest, food, and warmth." Caleb exhaled slowly, relief softening his features. While Mrs. Hawkins tended to Lena, Caleb turned to Mara. Her small body shook from cold and fear. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The coat was far too big, swallowing her like a blanket, but Mara hugged it tight. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Mara nodded, though she looked unsure whether she should admit it. Caleb smiled faintly. "Let's get you something warm." He brought her to the kitchen, where he ladled hot stew into a bowl and set it in front of her. Mara ate slowly at first, as if afraid it might disappear. But with each spoonful, her eyes softened, her shoulders loosening. Caleb stayed nearby, pretending to busy himself with chores but stealing glances at the little girl who had appeared so suddenly in his life. As she ate, a soft shuffle came from the hallway. Caleb turned to see his daughter, Ellie, standing there. The 9-year-old girl peeked around the corner, her wide brown eyes fixed curiously on Mara. "Ellie," Caleb said gently. "This is Mara. Her mama wasn't doing well, so they're staying with us for now." Ellie said nothing. She rarely spoke much, but she stepped closer, almost shyly. She stared at Mara's bowl, then at her tired little face. Something in her expression softened. After a moment, she went to the cupboard, took out a piece of cornbread, and placed it silently beside Mara's bowl. Mara looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she whispered. Ellie nodded once, a small gesture but full of meaning. Caleb watched them with a quiet ache in his chest, a mixture of hope and sorrow. Ellie had been lonely since her mother's passing, retreating into silence. Seeing her reach out, even a little, sparked something warm inside him. He glanced toward the guest room where Lena slept, then at the two little girls, one timid, one trembling, who were already drawing near each other like lost souls finding warmth. As snow fell softly outside, Caleb felt a shift he couldn't yet explain. The ranch, for the first time in years, didn't feel empty. The next morning dawned pale and frosty, the kind of winter sunrise where the sky looked washed with silver. The ranch was quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic creak of the windmill. Inside the warm cabin, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft lines across the guest room bed where Lena lay sleeping. Caleb entered quietly with a cup of warm broth. Mrs. Hawkins had insisted he check on Lena, though truthfully he needed no urging. He had barely slept, worrying she might worsen in the night. But when he saw her eyes flutter open slowly, relief washed over him like a warm tide. "Where?" Lena whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're safe," Caleb said gently. "At my ranch. Your daughter's right outside, eating breakfast." Lena's posture softened at the mention of Mara. "Thank you," she murmured, tears welling. I didn't know if we'd survive the night." "There's no need for thanks," he replied. "Just focus on getting your strength back." He set the broth on the bedside table, nodded once, and left her to rest. But someone else had been hovering nearby Ellie, peeking from behind the doorframe. The moment Caleb stepped away, Ellie slipped inside with quiet steps. She stood near the foot of the bed, hugging a small rag doll to her chest. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she simply stared at Lena with a mixture of curiosity and longing. Lena blinked at the child, managing a faint, warm smile. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. Ellie lowered her gaze and nodded, then hurried out of the room as though afraid she'd overstayed. Lena had no way of knowing it, but that brief moment planted a seed inside Ellie's heart. By midday, Lena had regained enough strength to sit up, and Caleb allowed Mara to visit. The reunion between mother and daughter was full of relieved tears, quiet embraces, and whispered reassurances that they were finally safe. When Caleb stepped in, he found both of them clinging to each other, gratitude written plainly on their faces. "You take all the time you need here," he said. "There's no rush to leave." Lena fought back tears again, this time from the overwhelming kindness of a stranger. But it wasn't only Caleb watching her closely. Ellie lingered nearby, half hidden behind furniture or doorways, her eyes tracking Lena's every move. When Lena smiled, Ellie softened. When Lena laughed softly at something Mara said, Ellie's expression brightened. And when Lena stood, even shakily, Ellie straightened as though waiting for direction. Mrs. Hawkins noticed first. "Caleb," she whispered quietly in the kitchen, "that girl is clinging to the widow like a lost kitten." Caleb glanced toward the hallway where Ellie was quietly trailing behind Lena and Mara as they explored the living area. "She's never taken to anyone this quickly," he admitted, something tight in his voice. "And that means something," Mrs. Hawkins replied. "Maybe more than you realize." Later that afternoon, Lena sat by the fire, warming her hands while Mara and Ellie played on the rug with one of Ellie's few toys, a wooden horse. Ellie rarely shared it with anyone, but today she placed it in Mara's hands without hesitation. The two girls sat close, whispering, giggling softly, building imaginary stories of ranch adventures. Lena watched them with a tender ache. She had always feared Mara would grow up without stability, without friends, without a sense of home. Now, seeing Ellie lean her head gently against her daughter's shoulder, she felt a fragile hope bloom. When the fire popped, Ellie shifted her gaze to Lena. Her eyes lingered, filled with a quiet plea. Slowly, she crawled closer, resting her small head on Lena's knee with the trust of a child longing for comfort. Lena's breath caught. She gently stroked Ellie's hair. The girl exhaled softly, a sound of relief like a door unlocking deep inside her heart. For the first time in years, Caleb's daughter felt the warmth of a mother's touch. And Lena, still recovering, still broken in places, felt something stir inside her too, a sense of belonging she hadn't dared to dream of again. The following days settled into a gentle rhythm, the kind Lena hadn't known in years. Each morning began with the smell of coffee drifting through the cabin, the soft clatter of Mrs. Hawkins preparing breakfast, and the steady hum of ranch chores outside. Mara and Ellie would wake together, tiptoeing down the stairs like two little mice before sitting side by side at the table. It didn't take long for them to feel like sisters. Lena, still regaining her strength, found herself quietly observing the life unfolding around her. Caleb's ranch was humble but filled with warmth, a place that breathed stability, the kind of home she feared she'd never be able to give her daughter again. But beneath that warmth was a deeper current, one of unspoken emotions, old wounds, and fragile hope. A moment of honesty. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the barn and cast a golden glow across the fields, Lena stepped outside for some fresh air. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked cautiously toward the fence. Her strength had returned, but not fully. She needed to breathe, to think. She hadn't expected Caleb to already be there, leaning against the fence post with a coil of rope at his feet. His sleeves were rolled up, and the last light of the day turned his hair copper at the edges. He glanced her way. "Feeling stronger?" he asked. "A little," she said softly. I'm trying. Caleb nodded, then watched the cattle graze in the distance. Out here, he murmured, healing takes time. But you're safe to do that here. Those words struck her deeply. Safe. It had been so long since she felt that. Taking a deep breath, Lena gathered the courage she didn't know she had. I should tell you the truth, she said gently, about why Mara and I were out there. In the cold. Caleb turned to her fully, his expression open and patient. And so she told him. She spoke of her husband's death, how sickness took him quickly, leaving her with debts she couldn't escape. She described the landlord who demanded rent. She didn't have the neighbors too fearful or poor to help the final day when they were forced to leave their home with nothing but a suitcase and a mother's desperation. She told him about nights spent in abandoned sheds, barns, and under trees. About feeding Mara while she went hungry. About wandering until her legs could no longer carry her. Through it all, Caleb didn't interrupt. He didn't pity her. He simply listened, his jaw tightening only when she described the cruelty she had endured. When she finished, her voice trembled. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door. Caleb stepped closer, his tone steady. You didn't bring trouble, he said. You brought two people who needed help. And that's reason enough. Lena's eyes burned with unshed tears. But Caleb wasn't finished. My own story ain't much prettier, he said quietly. Ellie's mom, she died 3 winters ago. Fever took her. After that, Ellie stopped talking much, stopped smiling. And I ain't been the best at raising a girl on my own. His voice cracked slightly, so brief Lena wondered if she imagined it. I try, he continued. God knows I try. But ranch work is hard, and grief's harder. Sometimes I think I failed her. Lena's breath caught. You've given her a home, she said gently. You've kept her safe. That is something many children don't have. Caleb looked away, swallowing. Maybe, but she needed more. A woman's tenderness. Someone who knows how to soothe a child's heart. And then you came. And she's been different, lighter, happier. The confession hung in the air between them, tender and raw. Lena placed a hand on the fence, steadying herself. She's a precious girl, she whispered. She just needed someone to show her she's not alone. Caleb glanced at her, something warm flickering in his eyes, a quiet, growing respect. An unspoken bond. They stood there, side by side, as the sky darkened into twilight. No grand declarations, no hurried emotions, just two broken people finding comfort in honesty. And though neither said it aloud, something had shifted. Trust had begun to grow. A fragile thread between them, one that would soon become unbreakable. The days that followed blended into a gentle, almost tender routine, one that neither Lena nor Caleb had expected, yet both quietly cherished. The ranch, once echoing with silence and loss, began to hum with small voices, footsteps, and the sound of laughter drifting through the halls like warm sunlight breaking through cold clouds. Lena woke each morning with purpose. Though Caleb insisted she rest, she could not sit still while others worked. She rose early to help Mrs. Hawkins knead dough, rinse vegetables from the root cellar, and stoke the fire. The act of contributing, of being useful, steadied her heart. She had spent so long feeling like a burden, constantly turned away, that even simple work felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Mara and Ellie became inseparable. Their friendship blossomed naturally, as if their souls recognized each other after long loneliness. They fed the chickens, chased each other around the barn, and sat cross-legged on the rug by the fire at night, whispering secrets only children could understand. Whenever Lena glanced across the room and saw them hand in hand, her throat tightened. Mara had never had a friend her own age. Now she had Ellie. And Ellie had her. But it wasn't just the girls who grew closer. Caleb noticing the changes, Caleb found himself watching Lena more than he cared to admit. Not in the way a man watches a stranger, but the way someone recognizes something quietly precious. He noticed how she spoke gently to the animals, how her presence softened the edges of the house, how she always made sure Mara ate her fill before she took a bite herself. One morning he approached the kitchen just as Lena was humming softly, kneading dough by the window. Her hair, loosely braided, caught the sunlight, and her voice mingled with the sounds of the ranch awakening outside. Caleb paused, leaning one shoulder against the doorway without making a sound. He simply watched her, that rare peace settling in his chest, a peace he had not felt since before his wife died. Mrs. Hawkins noticed, of course. She always noticed. She smirked as she stirred the pot of stew. "If you stare any harder, Caleb Ward, that dull blush," she murmured under her breath. Caleb coughed, embarrassed but smiling faintly before slipping away to the barn. Lena's quiet healing as Lena grew stronger, so did her sense of belonging. The ranch wasn't just shelter, it was becoming home. She found herself relaxing for the first time in years, laughing with Mrs. Hawkins, teasing Mara gently, and even smiling when she and Caleb brushed hands accidentally while working. Yet there was a part of her that remained cautious. She reminded herself often, "This is temporary. You mustn't hope for more." But hope is a quiet thing, slipping through cracks when least expected. A night by the fire. One evening, after a long day of chores and children's play, the group gathered near the fireplace. Mara sat curled in Lena's lap while Ellie rested at her side, head tucked against her shoulder. Caleb sat across from them, boots off, hands loosely folded. He watched his daughter, the same girl who had spent years speaking only when necessary, giggling, leaning into another woman with complete trust. His heart tightened painfully. He remembered nights when Ellie would cry in bed, calling for a mother who would never return. He remembered failing to soothe her, sitting helplessly outside her door, wishing he could erase her grief. Now she looked whole, and the person who had brought that light back into her life was sitting right there. Lena stroked Ellie's hair without thinking, humming softly as the girls drifted toward sleep. When she looked up, her eyes met Caleb's across the fire. Neither spoke, but a silent understanding passed between them. A quiet acknowledgement of something forming, something delicate but undeniably real. The warmth of routine had settled over the ranch like a gentle blanket, but life, especially for people who had known hardship, rarely stayed peaceful for long. Even as snow began to melt at the edges of the fields and the first hints of spring whispered through the air, a shadow crept toward the Ward Ranch. And though no one yet sensed it, everything was about to change. A letter arrives. It happened on an otherwise ordinary morning. Caleb was fixing the fence by the north pasture while Lena hung laundry on the line, her hands warmed by the early sun. The girls played nearby, building a fort from hay bales. Their laughter drifted across the yard like music. Then a horse approached from the main road, slow, deliberate. The rider wore a dark coat, and even from a distance Lena recognized the heaviness of his presence. Caleb straightened, sensing trouble instantly. The man dismounted and reached into his saddlebag. "Caleb Ward?" he asked, voice stiff. "That'd be me." The man handed Caleb an envelope sealed with a red wax crest. "Message from the county office," he said, then tipped his hat and rode away. Lena watched, unease prickling up her spine. Caleb stood there for a long moment before opening the letter. His eyes scanned the page, and his jaw tightened until the muscles jumped. When he finished reading, he folded the paper carefully, then too calmly tucked it into his pocket. Lena approached him slowly. "Is everything all right?" Caleb forced a breath. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Lena had learned enough about him to know when something wasn't fine. Ellie senses it too that evening. The tension in the air was thick. Caleb spoke little at dinner, his usual steady presence replaced by a quiet heaviness. He barely touched his food. Even Ellie, who tended to keep her emotions tucked tightly inside, watched him with anxious eyes. After supper, Lena found Ellie standing near the doorway to the porch, clutching her toy horse. "Is Papa mad?" Ellie whispered. Lena knelt beside her. No, sweetheart, he's worried. That's different, Ellie swallowed, leaning into Lena's shoulder for comfort, as she often did now. Lena wrapped an arm around her gently. He'll tell us when he's ready. Ellie nodded. But her small hand gripped Lena's sleeve with a quiet plea. Don't leave him alone. Caleb confesses later that night, after the girls slept, Caleb finally stepped into the lamplit kitchen where Lena was cleaning up. His steps were slow, heavy. She sensed immediately that the moment she'd been dreading had arrived. He set the folded letter on the table. You should read this, he said quietly. Lena hesitated, then picked it up. As her eyes moved across the words, her stomach dropped. It was a legal notice. A man named William Harolina's deceased husband's distant cousin claimed he was Mara's rightful guardian. He argued that Lena was unfit to care for a child due to homelessness and inability to provide stable shelter. He demanded Mara be turned over to him within a month. Lena's hands trembled violently. No, she whispered. No, he can't. He never cared about Mara. He never even visited us. Caleb's eyes smoldered with restrained fury. The law don't always care about blood or kindness. Sometimes it cares only about signatures. He took a deep breath. He's got money, influence, enough to make this ugly. Tears welled in Lena's eyes. I can't lose my daughter. Caleb, I'd die. Caleb stepped closer, his voice rough with emotion. You're not losing her. We'll fight this. Lena shook her head. How can we? I have nothing. No home, no money, no family left. Caleb's jaw set in determination, something intense sparking in his gaze. You have me, he said firmly, and this ranch. And Ellie, you're not alone in this fight. But Lena's panic only deepened. Caleb, I can't let Mara be taken. I'll run again. I'll disappear into the night if I have to. He grabbed her hands, steadying them. You won't run, he said, voice low but unshakable. Because I won't let anyone take your girl. Not while I'm still breathing. Their eyes locked, fear in hers, fire in his. And in that moment, Lena realized something startling. Caleb wasn't just helping them anymore. He was protecting them like family. Like a man who had already made up his mind about where they belonged. The next morning brought a gentler snowfall, the kind that drifted lazily from the sky as though the storm had finally tired itself out. The ranch felt unusually peaceful quiet in a way that made the world seem smaller, softer. Inside the warm cabin, the aroma of frying eggs and wood smoke mingled in the air as the poor girl slowly opened her eyes. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The quilt tucked up to her chin, the sound of crackling logs, and the faint hum of someone moving in the kitchen. Then she saw him, the rancher, standing with his sleeves rolled up, carefully stirring something in a pot like he was afraid of waking her. The sight made her chest tighten in a way she didn't understand. He noticed her awake and turned, offering her one of those rare smiles she was beginning to crave. Morning. How are you feeling? His voice was warm but gentle, as if he still feared she might vanish if he spoke too loudly. She shifted, wincing at a dull ache in her ribs. A little sore, she admitted, but safe. The words slipped out without thought, and when she saw the flicker of softness cross his eyes, she realized it was the truth. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. He brought her breakfast eggs, thick slices of bread toasted over the fire, and a steaming mug of tea. It was more food than she'd seen in weeks. The moment the plate settled on her lap, her hands trembled, not just with hunger, but with uncertainty. He noticed, but he didn't rush her, didn't push, just sat nearby and waited. When she finally began to eat, the rancher looked almost relieved. While she ate, he stepped outside to tend to the horses. Through the small window she could see him moving through the snow, brushing frost from the saddle, checking hooves, feeding them hay. Everything he did was slow and purposeful, like a man who spoke more with his hands than his voice. She found herself watching, memorizing the way his coat lifted in the wind, the way his hat dipped low over his eyes, the way he offered quiet pats to each animal as if each one mattered deeply. Something inside her warmed in a place she had long assumed frozen. When he returned, his boots dusted with snow, she finally asked the question that had been pressing on her heart. "Why did you save me? You didn't even know me." He hesitated, leaning against the table as though weighing how much truth he could give. Finally, he answered softly, "No one deserves to die alone in the cold. Not while I'm around." Her breath caught. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions. She wasn't used to anyone choosing to help her simply because they could. He noticed her staring at the floor, twisting the blanket between her fingers. "You don't owe me anything," he added gently. "You can rest here as long as you need. No questions. No expectations." That made her eyes sting. But part 7 wasn't only about recovery. This was the part where their bond quietly deepened, where silence spoke louder than words. As the day unfolded, he mended a broken chair, sharpened tools, and kept the fire steady while she rested. But every so often, their eyes would meet just fleeting glances, warm, curious, unfamiliar. By evening, she had gathered the courage to stand and take a few careful steps. He was instantly at her side, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. The contact sent a surprising spark through her, and when their eyes locked, they froze, neither quite ready for what the moment meant. "You're healing," he murmured. "Because of you," she whispered back. Snow fell softly outside, but inside the cabin, something new, fragile, hesitant, but real had begun to grow between them. The storm had finally passed by the following morning, leaving the world washed in white, glittering beneath a pale winter sun. The ranch looked like something out of a dream, icy fences, frosted pines, and fields of untouched snow stretching endlessly. Inside the cabin, warmth still wrapped itself around the girl like a protective blanket. But today she felt stronger, aware of her own body again instead of just the pain inside it. The rancher was already awake, boots laced and firewood stacked by the door. He glanced at her as she stirred, offering the same quiet nod he always did. But something was different this morning, an unspoken anticipation between them. "You're steady enough to try walking outside," he said gently. "Fresh air might help." She nodded, though her heart fluttered nervously. Being outside meant facing the cold again, the place where she almost died. But his presence beside her eased that fear. He didn't offer his hand outright, but the way he stood close enough to catch her, careful enough not to crowd her, made her feel safe. When she stepped outside and the brisk air brushed her cheeks, she didn't shiver in fear this time. Instead, she breathed it in deeply, like reclaiming something the storm had almost taken from her. The snow crunched softly under their boots as he guided her to the stable, walking slow for her sake. She noticed again how he existed in silence, not because he lacked words, but because he saved them for when they mattered. His quiet was gentle, not empty. In a world that had always been harsh to her, his silence felt like shelter. Inside the stable, warmth rose from the horses' bodies. A chestnut Mari lifted her head and snorted softly at the girl. Instinctively, she held out a hand, then paused and looked at the rancher as if asking permission. "She likes you," he said simply, stepping beside her. "Horses know hearts better than people do." She touched the Mari's velvety nose, and something inside her softened further. It had been so long since she had touched anything that wasn't cold, rough, or dangerous. Here, surrounded by gentle creatures and the low creaking of wood beams, the world felt tender. The rancher watched her quietly. He wasn't a man who stared openly, but today he couldn't look away. There was life in her eyes again, warmth, wonder, something almost like hope. "Thank you," she whispered suddenly, her voice cracking. "For everything." He opened his mouth, then closed it, as though unsure what to do with gratitude he had never asked for. Finally, he spoke. "You don't owe me thanks." I'm just glad you're alive." Those words struck deeper than he intended. She blinked fast, trying to swallow the knot in her throat. No one had ever said they were glad she existed, not like that. Not with sincerity that came from somewhere quiet and honest. On their slow walk back to the cabin, he noticed her steps faltering. Without hesitation, he placed a steady hand on her back, not pushing, not pulling, just supporting. The contact sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. When they reached the porch, she paused and looked up at him. "You make it feel less cold," she said softly. He stiffened for a moment, as though her words slipped under the armor he wore so carefully. But then he relaxed, just a fraction, and nodded. "So do you," he admitted. Inside, the fire crackled, casting gold light across the room. She sat near it, watching the flames dance while he brewed tea. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it pulsed with something slow and growing. Like a heartbeat they were both just beginning to hear. As evening filled the cabin, she realized Part 8 marked a turning point. Not only was she healing in body, but something deeper, something fragile, something hopeful had begun to heal too. The first hints of spring were beginning to pierce through the winter's grip. Patches of green poked through the snow along the edges of the fields, and the sun shone with a softer warmth. At the ranch, the air was full of quiet energy. Chickens clucked as they scratched the ground. The horses whinnied softly, and the creak of the windmill against the blue sky echoed across the farm. It was a morning that promised change, though no one knew exactly how much. Lena sat on the porch, brushing Mara's hair while Ellie sat nearby, quietly mimicking the motions. The two girls' laughter had become a regular melody at the ranch, a sound that had been absent for far too long. As Lena ran her fingers through Mara's tangled curls, she felt the weight of the past months, the fear, the hunger, the cold, and realized how far they had come. But her heart still trembled at the thought of losing Mara to someone who would take her away, someone who claimed legal rights but had no love to offer. Caleb appeared quietly in the yard, holding a bundle of freshly cut firewood. When he saw Lena on the porch with the girls, his expression softened. Something about the sight, the mother and daughter, and his own child so naturally included, stirred feelings in him he could no longer deny. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, and leaned casually against the railing. "You two look different this morning," he said, a subtle warmth creeping into his voice. "Happy, at peace." Lena smiled faintly but didn't look up. "We feel safe," she admitted softly. "Thanks to you." He shifted, meeting her eyes. "No, don't thank me. We're a family here, aren't we? And families protect each other. That's what we do." The words caught her off guard. She looked down at Mara, then at Ellie, then back at Caleb. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. She realized what he meant and what she had begun to hope for. That this wasn't just protection he offered, it was care, commitment, something far more intimate than she had expected. Ellie, sensing the shift in the air, stood and ran over, tugging at Lena's hand. "Mama, don't leave," she whispered, her voice small but urgent. Mara clutched her mother's other hand. "We want to stay," she added. Lena swallowed hard, feeling tears welling in her eyes. She realized in that moment that this place, this ranch, this man, these children had already become home in every sense of the word. The thought of leaving was unbearable. Caleb stepped closer, and the air seemed to hold its breath. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He knelt slightly so that his eyes met hers directly. "Lena, I don't want you to leave. Not Mara, not you. We belong here, together, and if you'll have me, I want you to stay. Not just as a guest, but as part of this family. As my wife." The words struck her with the force of something both terrifying and beautiful. Lena's lips trembled. For weeks, she had feared trust, feared hope, feared love. And yet, here it was offered plainly, without conditions, without pity, without hesitation. Her hands gripped Caleb's, her tears spilling freely now. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I will stay." The girls erupted into delighted laughter, hugging them both, and Ellie whispered softly against Lena's shoulder, "You're our family now." Caleb smiled, a quiet, relieved, and genuine smile that reflected the same feeling in Lena's heart. The storm of the past months, the fear, the hunger, the endless wandering had finally given way to something new. Together they stood on the porch, watching the sunlight reflect off the melting snow, and for the first time in a long while, they didn't feel broken. They were whole, united by love, trust, and the fragile yet unshakable bond of a family forged not by blood, but by choice. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, now buzzed with life, laughter, and hope. And for Lena, Mara, Ellie, and Caleb, the future, though uncertain, felt safe, warm, and full of possibility. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and golden, with the sun reflecting off the last patches of snow on the ranch. The air was still, carrying the quiet hum of a world finally at peace. For Lena, this day felt almost surreal. Just months ago, she had been a weary widow, wandering the countryside with her daughter Mara, unsure if they would survive the cold night. Now, she stood in a simple yet beautiful dress, the fabric brushing softly against her legs, her heart racing with hope and love. Caleb stood nearby, adjusting his coat and smoothing his hat with nervous hands. Though he had faced the hardships of ranch life, this was uncharted territory for him, opening his heart fully to someone, offering a lifelong promise of love. He glanced at Lena and felt an ache of gratitude and awe. She had transformed his home, his daughter, and even himself in ways he had never imagined. Ellie and Mara were the first to arrive at the clearing near the barn where the ceremony would be held. Ellie wore her favorite dress, the color of springtime daisies, and clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. Mara mirrored her, holding hands with Ellie as they skipped lightly, their laughter echoing like music across the ranch. Both girls stopped in front of Lena, eyes shining, waiting. "Are you ready, Mama?" Ellie asked softly. Lena knelt to hug them both. "I am." "And so ready," she whispered, brushing a stray curl from Ellie's forehead. Caleb stepped forward, his voice steady but warm. "Lena, from the moment I first saw you and Mara, I knew our lives could be different. You brought warmth, laughter, and love where there was none. I can't promise life will always be easy, but I can promise you this, our family will face it together." Tears glimmered in Lena's eyes as she took his hands. "Caleb, I never imagined anyone could make us feel this safe. You've given us a home, a family, and hope. I can't imagine life without you now." With the girls standing beside them, the vows were exchanged in soft words carried on the winter air. There was no grand ceremony, no elaborate decorations, just the warmth of love, the joy of two children watching their family become whole, and the quiet certainty that they belonged together. When Caleb slid a simple ring onto Lena's finger, her hand shook, and he squeezed it gently. Mara and Ellie clapped softly, then threw their arms around both of them, squealing with delight. For the first time, Lena saw the reflection of her own happiness mirrored in her daughter and in Ellie's eyes. The rest of the day unfolded with laughter, music from an old fiddle Caleb had learned as a boy, and the scent of fresh bread and stew filling the cabin. Neighbors and friends from the small town, having seen the genuine love and trust in this newly formed family, joined in the celebration. Even those who had doubted or whispered about Lena's past quietly acknowledged that she and Caleb had built something true and lasting. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the ranch, Lena and Caleb walked hand in hand with Mara and Ellie, their shadows long and intertwined on the snowy ground. They stopped at the edge of the field, looking out over the land that had witnessed both hardship and redemption. Caleb whispered softly, We've come a long way, haven't we?" Lena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Yes, and this is only the beginning." For Lena, Mara, Ellie, and Caleb, the ranch was no longer just a place of survival. It was a home built on love, trust, and the courage to embrace a future together. Their lives had been shaped by loss and hardship, but they had chosen to rise above it, forging bonds stronger than blood, stronger than fear. In that moment, standing beneath the open sky, they knew something profound and unshakable. A family isn't always born, it is made. And theirs had been made by love.